I am a sick man. I am a spiteful man. An unattractive man. I think that my liver hurts. But actually, I don't know a damn thing about my illness. I'm not even sure what it is that hurts. I'm not in treatment, never have been, although I respect both medicine and doctors. Besides, I am superstitious in the extreme. Well, at least to the extent of respecting medicine. I am sufficiently educated not to be superstitious, but I am. No, sir. I refuse to see a doctor simply out of spite. Now, that is something you'll probably fail to understand. Well, I understand it. Naturally, I will not be able to explain to you precisely whom I will injure in this instance by my spite. I know perfectly well that I am certainly not giving the doctors a dirty deal by not seeking treatment. I know better than anyone that I will only harm myself by this and no one else. And yet, if I don't seek a cure, it is out of spite. My liver hurts? Good. Let it hurt still more.
These are the opening words of Notes from Underground by Dostoevsky. A gnarly, nasty book about a shitty person who feels shitty ways about people and behaves in shitty ways toward himself and toward others because he feels shitty. There you go. You don't have to read it. That's the gist of it. Now, this book, Notes from Underground by Dostoevsky, is one of the most important books I've ever read in my life. It came to me at a critical time in me trying to figure out who I am and who I could be. And, it dealt with a lot of issues that I was dealing with personally at the time, in my thoughts and the way I was viewing the world and the way I was viewing myself, in the way I was viewing the future and the present and the past. And, I read this book. The funny thing about this book, for the record, if you haven't read this book, I'm going to spoil the fuck out of it. But I think it'll still be worth reading, even if you listen to this podcast. And if you decide to stop here so that I don't spoil the book, I would understand. Come back after you read it, if you feel like it. Or not, do your thing. Live your life. Anyway. The gist of this book is, it's divided into two sections, really. The first half of the book is the narrator. And it's a short book, by the way. It's only 130 pages on a small paperback. The book's divided into two sections, right? The first section is basically a letter from the narrator to the reader. Why the narrator is writing this, who knows? He doesn't even know. He makes a point out of telling you he doesn't know. And, it's... The thing about this guy is, to some degree, everything he's doing and thinking is mental masturbation. He's incredibly cynical because he's learned how to do all these tricks with his mind, where he can take something that is good and reverse it. He can make it bad. He can zoom out and find the dark cloud in the silver lining, if you will. And, it's almost a superpower, the way that he can do this, because what it does is it gets you out of doing anything. Because anything you do is inherently dumb or pointless or flawed. And that's the hardest part about that is that is actually the case. Nobody is doing things perfectly the first time or the last time. I mean, if people could do things perfectly, civilization would be radically different. If you notice, what we're doing now is slightly better than what we were doing 10 years ago, which is slightly better than we were doing 10 years before then, and so on and so forth. Nobody's coming up with the perfect solution for anything. And that's a difficult thing to live with, right? To know that no matter what you do and no matter how hard you try, you're still going to fuck up. And, that's scary because fucking up sucks. It hurts. When you're trying to do something and you fail to do it, or you're trying to get something and you fail to get it, it hurts. It sucks. You feel disappointed. And what the author of this letter the narrator of the book stumbled upon, it seems to me, is that if you could view everything cynically enough, no matter how good it is, or, how obviously it is impacting the lives of other people around you in a positive way, if you can find the reasons to be cynical about it, you can get out of doing it. And not only can you get out of doing it, you can convince yourself that you're smarter than the people who are doing it because they're doing it. The narrator talks about men of action, and he feels superior to the men of action because the men of action hasn't realized this, that the men of action haven't realized this yet, that all action is flawed and therefore not worth taking. So he is superior to them because he abstains from acting. Now, when I first read this book, I read this first half, and I thought of this guy as a hero to me. I felt like he was dissecting the world in ways that it critically needed dissected, and he brought up points that I felt I identified with thoroughly to the bone, and a lot of it was about this sort of parallelization of identifying flaws. And we'll talk a little bit about how I was feeling and thinking. This podcast, for the record, is more about me than about this book, probably. I haven't read this book in a while, like I said. So some of the things I say about this book, even though I've got it right in front of me, might be totally fucked up. I don't know. I'm not making any promises. I'm just trying to get some shit off my chest. Because right now, I'm going through it. I'm going through some hard times, as we all do. And I'm when you get real depressed, sometimes you think about other times you were depressed. Well, I started thinking about the time I read this book. Because like I said, when I first read this book, I was feeling really cynical about the world, really cynical about my place in the world. Like the world was filled primarily with negative potential, if you would. And I'm pretty much feeling that way now. I'm going through it. Like I said, I'm feeling, I'm sort of feeling like everything's pointless, and that, the world is too complex to navigate properly. So why really try to do the things that I should do? Because there are so many of them that there's no way I could possibly do them all well. And if I'm just going to fuck them up, why not let them be, And that's how I feel despite learning this lesson. Let me tell you about the second half of the book. So after he goes on this long rant about how terrible things are and how much smarter he is than everybody for the fact that he decides not to act, he gets wrapped up in some social situations. Like, this dude's pretty much a bum. He's not doing shit with his life. He's not doing anything but kind of living in squalor, not seeing anybody, hiding inside his house. He's kind of got it made. And he ends up encountering a few people that he knows, and you start to see the mindset that he describes in the first half of the book. This mindset that I felt I had, or that I identified strongly with. You get to see that in action around people and in play in the world, And that's where everything falls apart. He has these social interactions and he doesn't know how to behave himself. He makes a fool of himself repeatedly. He is jealous and egotistical and obnoxious in virtually every way that you can be, and petty and spiteful. And, he's basically a miserable sack of shit that goes around the world making other people miserable sacks of shit too, or trying to bring down anybody who's not a miserable sack of shit. And then the people who he thinks should look up to him for how smart he is don't want to be around him. And why is that? It's because he's an asshole. And obviously no one wants to be around him. All he does is bring people down and try to make himself look good. And so you see this mindset played out in the real world. And you see this man who, is actively causing people pain and misleading people and lying to people and hurting people simply because he's hurt. It was beneficial to me to see it in action. You know what I mean? Because, one thing about living in the world is you constantly have to not live the way you think in your head, right? I think everybody's familiar with that. You can't go off on everybody that you want to go off on. You can't be honest every time you want to be honest. Or maybe you can if you're brave, but that doesn't make it always, easy or maybe not appropriate. I guess there's a time and place for everything. But the world puts constraints on you. You have to sort of go out of your way to fit into some things, You have to warp your personality a bit, sometimes a lot, in order to fit into society, which you need to do because society sustains you, right? It's very difficult to maintain a job if you can't hold your tongue, for instance. And so what part 2 of this book kind of shows is how one might live if you let that side of you really animate you and you didn't hold it back, or me. I'm saying you, but I mean me. If I really held those beliefs as strongly as the narrator did, which, maybe I wasn't as passionate about it as he was because he was living it, right? But if I were to really take those ideas and those presuppositions and that way of observing the world and run it to its extreme, how would it play out? And it turns out it would be an absolute catastrophe, right? Not just for me, but for everyone else. Everyone I interacted with. So seeing that sort of shocked me, because like I said, when I'm reading the first half, I'm like, yeah, go this guy. And then I get to the second half, I finish the book and I'm like, wow, I got some shit to work on. You realize there are better ways to do it. And one of those ways is to be a man of action. So I suppose I'm going to go through this book a little bit and just kind of give examples. I'm probably just going to talk about things that I underlined, right? Just to give a sense for the kind of spirit this guy had, the kind of things that were on his mind and on mine.
But, my dear sirs, who would take pride in his own diseases and brag about them too? Yeah, what am I saying? Everybody does it. It's precisely their diseases that people pride themselves on, and I do, more perhaps than anybody else. Let's not argue. My objection was absurd, but that aside, I'm firmly convinced that not only excess of consciousness, but any consciousness at all is a disease. I stand on that. However, let us leave this for a moment to tell me now, why has it always been as though in spite that at moments when I was most capable of feeling all the refinements of the lofty and the beautiful, as they used to say among us once upon a time, yes, at those very moments no, not felt, but perpetrated such unseemly acts, such as, well, in a word, such acts are perhaps committed by everyone, but which in my case occurred as if on purpose, just when I was most keenly aware that they should never occur at all. The more aware I was of goodness and of everything lofty and beautiful, the deeper I sank into my slime, and the more likely I was to get mired down in it altogether. But the main point is that all this seemed to take place within me, not by chance, but as though it had to be so, as though this were my most normal condition, rather than a disease or a corruption, so that in the end, I even lost the will to fight this corruption. In the end, I almost came to believe, or perhaps really did come to believe, that this was indeed my normal condition.
Ouch. See, the scary thing about that to me is that it's about giving up, right? I've been thinking about giving up a lot. Not as in, I've been thinking about the verb giving up, like as in doing it. But I've been thinking of giving up the noun sort of like as a subject, if you know what I mean. Like if it could be an object, something you could observe and measure, giving up, something you could collect details on. I've also been thinking about giving up myself, coincidentally. But that's what prompts it, right? Why? Because I know people who have given up. You know? And I don't just mean like killing themselves, although those people have really given up. But also people who have lost motivation, lost hope. I've been that person more times than not, you know? Sometimes you can still be acting in the world, even progressing in the world, long after giving up. If you're good enough at going through the motions, you can get pretty far after giving up. And it just sort of happens naturally, accidentally, I suppose. But it doesn't matter how good things in your life get if you've given up. And that's the bizarre part. If you've given up, it's very difficult to see how the future could be any better than it is now, or how it could be any different than it is now in any way. You know, sometimes it's easy to picture how terrible things could get. But even that, when you've given up, a lot of times it's like, well, fuck it. You know, who cares? Who cares if it's worse than it is now? It's already shit. If it's negative 100 degrees outside, who cares if it's a negative 105? It's already way too cold to go out there. And when you're out there, you feel it. You know. Giving up's scary. And I guess, you know, I've had realizations about the importance of hope over the last few years. I don't think I've gotten very good at hoping yet. But I am hoping that hoping is a muscle that you can train yourself to use, and that you can learn that. See, this is part of the quest here, and this is why I've returned to this book. I know I'm fucked up. I'm super fucked up, and I am struggling a lot because of how fucked up I am. And if I could fix some of that, I would be in a better place. You know, I feel like I'm stressed out like a motherfucker all the time. Anxious, depressed. Life's hard. What if it was better? What if life itself was better? How would I feel? Because I run into this issue where I know things that would make my life better, like if I just mowed my grass regularly, for instance, then I wouldn't have to be stressed out about the fact that my grass is too long and I have to mow it every time I pull into my driveway. Think about all that stress that I wouldn't have to have if I was on my game, right? But just like the narrator here, who is particularly good at a few things and uses that as an excuse to suck at everything else, that's what I'm doing. That was a dumb sentence structure, but that's what I'm doing. I'm like, well, I got this good thing happening, this good thing happening, and I'm being responsible in all these other ways. Fuck my grass. But that you can't do that. That's the problem. That's the problem I'm having. I've got a ton of shit that needs to be done. Most of it is not super high priority to me, but it is necessary to keep the chaos at bay. It's a balancing act, As I'm getting older, I'm getting a lot more responsibility. It's happening pretty quickly. I've found myself in some pretty cool situations recently. I've had some pretty good opportunities. Things are actually going pretty good, but I feel like absolute shit. And why is that? It's because I'm not balancing my responsibilities properly. I get behind on things, and then they pile up, and I get intimidated by the big mountain of shit. And then I feel like giving up. And so that is the issue, right? And so I had this thought, what if I could make my life better while still feeling like shit, rather than wait until I don't feel like shit to make my life better? Seems like a reasonable proposition. I feel like if I can make life better, feeling like shit would happen less often. Even if I always feel like shit, maybe that's ingrained in me, Like the narrator's talking about here. Maybe it's not disease and corruption. Maybe I just am who I am and that person is fucked up. If that fucked up person didn't have to stress out about mowing his grass, I'm pretty sure he'd be better off. See what we're doing? Unpacking stuff here. That's what we're doing. Learning lessons. Here's another quote I have underlined.
Naturally, it would be the pleasure of despair, but then it's in despair that you find the sharpest pleasures, particularly when you are most acutely aware of the hopelessness of your position.
Shit on a goddamn dick. Do you ever have fun when things are terrible? I've described myself in the past as a chaos addict. There's a certain degree of fuckery that can happen where nothing makes sense. It seems like nothing's connected to anything else. It's like fireworks just going off in every direction. And in those moments, the air feels like everything is acceptable. Because nothing could get worse. You know what I mean? The worst thing that could happen is we don't die. When you're thinking that way, you can do anything. So when you're hopeless, when you're truly hopeless, when you are acutely aware of the hopelessness of your position, that's when you find the pleasure of despair. That's a bad place to be. Yeah, that's a bad place to be. We don't want to be there. Right. That's not good. But the problem is it's pleasure, right? If you can get there, if you can find your way to that acute awareness of the hopelessness of your position and enjoy that pleasure of despair, that's a muscle you can flex. I know that's a muscle you can flex. You can learn how to use that bad boy. You can learn to thrive and chaos and destruction. And this morality that I'm working on, I'm trying to figure out how to fit all the pieces of life together in a way that makes sense, which is hard because life is complex. But one thing I've figured out, I'm pretty sure, is that it is better to maximize life and well-being in yourself and in others, no matter who those others are, than it is to take away well-being or destroy life, as a rule. Obviously, there's nuance, right? I'm not saying assassinating Hitler would have been a bad thing to do. That's destroying life, technically. I'm not trying to make this black and white. But one thing I'm sure about is that being a source of suffering in the world and a cause of suffering, and the reason that joy is sucked out of your life and others and perpetuating that, is a bad thing. And the opposite of that must be good, right? And so that's why I got to get my shit together. Because I would rather be someone who contributes than someone who contributes to the creation rather than the destruction. How's that?
Well then, in my view, such a direct, simple man is the true, normal human being, the kind of human being that tender Mother Nature herself had hoped to see when she was lovingly creating him on Earth. I envy such a man to the point of loathing. He is stupid, I admit, but perhaps a normal man should be stupid. How do we know? Perhaps it's even very beautiful that way. And what particularly confirms me in this, if I may say so, suspicion, is that if you take, for example, the antithesis of the normal man, that is a man of heightened consciousness who has surely emerged not from the lap of nature but from a retort, this is almost mystical, gentlemen. But I suspect that too. This retort man often gives up so completely in the face of his antithesis that he honestly feels himself, with all his heightened consciousness, to be a mouse, not a man. He may be an acutely conscious mouse, but a mouse all the same, while the other is a man, and consequently, and so on and so forth. And the main thing again is that it's he himself who considers him a mouse. Nobody else asks him to, and that is the important part.
See, I think the issue here is that it really hits home on that last little paragraph. And the main thing again is that it's he himself who considers himself a mouse. Nobody else asks him to, and that is the important point. I feel like this is another symptom of giving up, to some degree. It's, or maybe it's a lack of self-respect, I think that's it. This is something I was thinking about recently that I'm sure you'll hear about soon. It's about respect, and it's about the idea that you should, in general, respect yourself at least as much as you're respecting anyone else in a given circumstance. Again, not black and white, but I feel like, in myself at least, and I feel like also what the narrator is describing here is this deferral to others, right? He considers himself a mouse while the other is a man. And, what are you going to do? You're going to let the man do what the man does, and you're going to sit there and be a mouse. You're going to go duck off in the corner and eat some cheese or something. And, the world is going to go by. You're going to let everybody else, make all the decisions, and you're just going to go along for the ride, hoping for crumbs of cheese. And sometimes I feel that way, I don't know exactly what it is that I'm lacking, whether it's, I don't feel like it's confidence. It might be confidence. I don't know. Because there are a lot of things where I feel pretty confident, I'm not a terribly confident person, but I also don't think I'm terribly incompetent or anything. So, I can typically hold my own when I need to. But in general, I feel this attitude of deferment, like, well, if that's what you want, you should have it even at my expense, as sort of a general rule, which is shitty, and I feel like part of that reason, why is that? Maybe I just assume that, the other person knows better, or I assume I'm not worthy of standing up for what I want or getting what I want. I don't exactly know, but what I did realize is that is the wrong attitude to take, in that sometimes I do know best and I should speak up, and I should not constantly defer to others. And sometimes I do it subconsciously too, like even in my head, with people I don't even know. This is probably not healthy, but sometimes I'm considering, like, being at a concert and watching a show and being concerned about how the multitude of people behind you are thinking about you or observing you or anything like dumb things like that. I feel like in the way, I guess, a lot. And I realized that I deserve to be standing there as much as anybody else does. And that's true about life. I should at least show myself as much respect as I show anybody else, assuming we're starting with a base level of respect. Obviously, there are people that I should show way more respect for than myself, and some people that I should show less. But as a rule, when interacting, especially with people that you don't have a relationship where you've built and maintained respect, maybe it's important to, give yourself as much respect as the stranger, just to make sure you don't get taken advantage of or miss out on opportunities, or, live your life like the narrator here, who never stands up for himself, never says anything that he wants, and never goes after anything he wants, and then consequently never gets anything that he wants.
The wretched mouse has, in addition to the first vileness, already managed to hedge itself around with a host of other vilenesses in the form of questions and doubts. It has added to the one initial question so many other unresolved questions that willy-nilly it will be caught up in a fatal morass, a stinking mess consisting of its own doubt and agitation, and finally of the spittle that rains upon it from the mouths of the direct men of action who solemnly stand around it as judges and arbiters, roaring with laughter as loudly as their healthy throats permit. Naturally, the only thing that's left to it is to shrug its little shoulders at the whole business in sheer disgust and slip back ignominiously into its hole with a smile of feigned contempt in which it doesn't itself believe.
It's a trap. It's a trap. I've said it once. I've said it a million times, and I'll say it a trillion more. Go listen to David Foster Wallace's This Is Water. It's on YouTube. It's in book form. It's not long. I think it's like a 20-minute thing on YouTube or something. It's like a commencement speech. It's not a lecture. It's not long. Do it. I'm going to go do it soon. The problem the mouse is having is that it's built its own walls out of thoughts and questions and doubts and agitations, rather than interacting with the world and being a man of action. The individual has chosen to be a mouse who does nothing but think. And that's it. I think if I had one question to ask God, I would ask, how important is thinking? I spent a lot of my life thinking. That's why this book resonated with me so much, is that I spent so much time thinking I couldn't act. I described before, I'm so lost in thought I can't see, and I mean that literally. I don't mean I've gone blind. I mean reality is playing in the background rather than in the foreground, to the point that I am not visually observing things with my consciousness. It's a trap. You can get lost. This is the sort of the purpose, or one of the purposes, of meditation. The act of becoming present is to tear down the walls that could turn you into a mouse. And boy, oh boy, if those walls don't get big and strong if you let them.
Or else I'd try to force myself to fall in love. In fact, I did, twice. And I suffered, gentlemen, I assure you I did. Deep down in your heart, you don't believe in your suffering. There's a stirring mockery, and yet you suffer in the most genuine and honest to goodness way.
Now ain't that a son of a bitch? This is commonly referred to as imposter syndrome, right? Where severely depressed, or have some mental disorder, or have been diagnosed with a disorder, and you don't even feel like you have it because you feel like you're pretending, and you've been pretending, just to get attention, or for whatever reason you might suspect yourself of pretending to be mentally ill. You discredit your own suffering while you're going through it. I do. I say you. I'm talking to myself largely, for the record. It's still very odd to me that this will go on the internet at some point, and other people may hear it. So when I say you, I mean me, but really I mean us. I think I mean people, but really I'm talking to myself. So keep that in mind as I insult you by assuming you have things in common with myself and this narrator.
Why, gentlemen, perhaps the only reason I regard myself as an intelligent man is that I've never in my whole life been able to either begin or finish anything. Oh, tell me, who is the first to declare, to proclaim, that man does vile things only because he does not realize his true interests? That if he were enlightened, if his eyes were open to his true, normal interests, he would immediately cease committing abominations, but would immediately become good and noble, because being enlightened and understanding his true advantage, he would inevitably see that only good is to his advantage, and everybody knows that no man will willingly act against his own interests. Consequently, he would of necessity, as it were, begin to do good. Oh, child, oh, poor innocent babe. Who has ever in all these millennia seen men acting solely for the sake of advantage? What's to be done with the millions of facts that attest to their knowingly, that is, with the full awareness of their true interests, dismissing these interests as secondary and rushing off in another direction, at risk, at hazard, without anyone or anything compelling them to do so, but as if solely in order to reject the designated road and stubbornly, willingly carve out another, a difficult, absurd one, seeking it out virtually in the dark.
Now, is that a noble feature of human beings, or is that jackassery? Is that the avoidance of responsibility or exploration? Could it be both? Is there a way to do both? Is there a way to maintain the prior paths while carving out new ones? If you have things that work, perhaps it's good to maintain them, but it's better to maintain them and advance them. One of the comforting things about this book is that somebody wrote these things down, which means I'm not the only person experiencing these things. And that is incredibly comforting, right? Does anybody else feel that way? That knowing you're not the only one struggling makes you feel a little better. Here's a quick one.
That even today, though man has learned to see more clearly on occasion than he did in the barbarian ages, he's still far from habituating himself to behave according to the dictates of reason and science.
Ain't that the truth? If I could just convince myself what to do, because I know what to do, 90% of the time I can tell you what the next move is. 10% of the time I actually do it. What's up with that?
That man, whoever he might be, has always and everywhere preferred to act according to his own wishes rather than according to the dictates of reason and advantage.
Yep. What's dumb is that I don't even want the stuff I want to want. Wouldn't that be cool if you could just want the stuff you want to want?
And although our life in these manifestations will often turn out a pretty sorry mess, it is still life and not mere extraction of square roots. After all, I quite naturally want to live in order to fulfill my whole capacity for living, and not in order to fulfill my reasoning capacity alone, which is no more than some 1/20th of my capacity for living. What does reason know? It only knows what it has managed to learn, and it may never learn anything else. That isn't very reassuring, but why not admit it? While human nature acts as a complete entity, with all that is in it, consciously or unconsciously, and though it may be wrong, it is nevertheless alive.
Shortly after.
There is only one occasion, only one, when man may purposely, consciously choose for himself even the harmful and the stupid, even the stupidest thing, just so that he will have the right to wish the stupidest thing and not be bound by the duty to have only intelligent wishes.
See, I think some of this that he's talking about is a rebellion against the having to force yourself into, I just said, wouldn't it be nice to be able to want what you want? But, a lot of times what people may want is to want what other people want. We create these norms and everybody sort of has to abide by them, with variation, not like you're forced. This isn't like North Korea kind of stuff that I'm talking about. I'm just talking about, there's a spectrum of acceptable behavior and you are expected to appear somewhere on it around the middle in general, right? And for people who feel in extremes, it can be quite stifling to live in a society that doesn't want you to express those extremes. Now, obviously, there are reasons it doesn't want you to express those extremes. At least sometimes. Sometimes it's better if you don't. At least publicly. Because there are things we depend on that shouldn't be carelessly unraveled. But that suppression seeks expression somewhere, right? That energy just doesn't go away. It shifts somewhere else, right? And then you end up acting out in other ways, and so in some ways, at the very beginning, he's talking about he's not going to go to the doctor out of spite. And this is an example, that's an example of what he's talking about here. You do stupid things. You want stupid things just to have the right to want something stupid, just to make a decision, just to gain some power in your life. You will rebel against yourself just to be able to express that sense of rebellion that's welling up in you. That's interesting.
The best definition of a man is a biped, ungrateful.
Yeah.
In short, anything can be said about world history, anything that might occur to the most distraught imagination. There's only one thing that cannot be said about it, that it is sensible. Why, the very word will stick in your throat.
You know, kind of what he's talking about a lot here, I'm noticing, is that there a lot of people aren't good at this. You know, we've all got this going on, and that's comforting. A lot of people are fucking up. You know, I feel like sometimes it's easy to forget that, especially when you're only in situations where you're seeing people doing pretty well, or people who are, 20 years further than you down the path, and you're like, man, that guy's really got his shit together. What's wrong with me? You don't see all the hard work and all the late nights and all the blood, sweat, and tears and all that shit. You just see the outcomes because you're not in that other person's head. You're not at home with them. You're not, you don't see them doing the work. And so sometimes I guess it can feel like I don't, why do I got to work so hard? Maybe other people don't have to work so hard, and I'm sure that's always true, right? Everybody's got things that they're innately good at and innately not. And if you're not good at something and yet you still have to do it, you're going to have to work harder to do it. I mean, that's just math, essentially. But it still needs done. And I'm not the only one that's got to work on it, clearly. Thanks, Dostoevsky. Here's one Jordan Peterson quotes all the time. I'm going to read this long-ass quote because I've heard him quoted a bunch, roughly. And it would be cool to just read this whole thing just for that.
And now I'll ask you, what can be expected of man, a creature endowed with such strange qualities? Why, shower him with every earthly good, drown him in happiness over his head so that only bubbles will spring up on the surface of this happiness as on water. Give him such economic prosperity that he'll have nothing left to do but sleep, eat pastries, and busy himself with assuring the continuance of world history. And even then, out of sheer ingratitude, sheer nastiness, he will commit some vileness. He'll even risk his pastries and deliberately choose the most pernicious nonsense, the most uneconomical absurdity, solely in order to inject his noxious, fantastic element into all that positive, sensible bliss. He will insist on clinging precisely to his own fantastic dreams, his most vulgar folly, solely in order to confirm to himself, as this were indeed so necessary, that men are still men, and not piano keys, which may be played by the hands of natural laws themselves, but which are threatened by this very playing to be brought to a state where there will no longer be possible to wish a thing outside of graphs and schedules. But even that isn't all. Even in case he really might turn out to be nothing but a piano key, and even if this were proved to him by the natural sciences and mathematics, man still won't come to his senses and will do something deliberately contrary, solely out of ingratitude and to insist on his own way. And if he should lack the means to do so, he will invent destruction and chaos, he will invent a variety of sufferings, and will have his own way no matter what. He will unleash a curse upon the world, and since only man is capable of cursing, that's his privilege and his chief distinction from other animals, he will perhaps attain his end just by cursing. In other words, he will prove to himself that he is a man and not a piano key. If you will say that all this, the chaos and the darkness and the curse, can be calculated according to a table so that the very possibility of advanced calculation will stop it at all, the reason will retain upper hand, the man will deliberately go insane for the occasion in order to have no reason and still get his way. I believe this. I vouch for this. Because all of man's purpose, it seems to me, really consists of nothing but proving to himself every moment that he is a man and not an organ stop. Proving it even at the cost of his own skin. even at the cost of turning back into a troglodyte. And after that, how can one resist the temptation of boasting that it still isn't so, that man is still not a piano key, that human desires still depend on the devil knows what? You shout to me, if you deign to shout at me, that nobody is depriving me of will, that the only thing in question is to arrange things in such a way that my will itself, by its own free will, shall coincide with my normal interests in the laws of nature and with arithmetic. Ah, gentlemen, what kind of independent will can there be when it comes down to graphs and arithmetic, when nothing counts but 2 times 2 makes 4? 2 times 2 will be 4 even without my will. Is that what you call man's free will?
So clearly, something Jordan Peterson focuses on about that bit is that man can't have too much order, right? That too much order is stifling, and that will fight it. And so another thing that's important is variation in that trait, right? So there will be some people who sort of despise order or thrive outside of order. And for those people, forcing order on them feels very oppressive. And there are other people who have the opposite, you know. This is, if you take my grass, for instance. I hate mowing my grass. I think it's stupid. I think the fact that we have grass lawns is stupid. Why? Why grass? Why? Anyway. It could be anything, man. It really could. We went with grass. So I'll be honest. I suck at mowing that shit. I don't do it often enough. It gets long. It gets nasty. And the longer it gets, the less I want to do it, because the more it sucks. And I don't want to do it at first, even when it's short, because it sucks. So it's just getting worse and worse. It's bad. It's a feedback loop, right? It's not good. To me, it feels oppressive that, and I mean that, it feels that way. I'm not going to go to bat, like, with society. Like, don't make me cut my grass, because I get it. You got to cut your grass. Otherwise, you get shit in there. You get ticks. You get snakes. You get little rabbits digging holes and, you know, breeding, and hawks coming down and slaughtering them in your lawn. See, doesn't that sound way more interesting than having 3-inch grass? Tell me. Doesn't it sound more interesting? Anyway. So, you know, I'm being stifled by having to cut my grass. There are other people who have the opposite experience about me not cutting my grass, right? To them, order is where they thrive. They don't like the chaos. They want order. They want things to look nice and pretty and predictable. And to them, if my lawn is not mowed, they're like, oh, look at that dope head lives there. So, you know, it's a balancing act, and you need both sorts of those people in society to balance each other out, because it's all about balance. And so when you find yourself, this is the issue, though, that means there are people who find themselves on the extreme that must live with the rest of the world. You know, how does someone who thrives in chaos live in a world that depends on structure? Because by definition, living in the world, you're forced into other people's structure, right? If you want food, you can't necessarily go somewhere at 2 a.m. and get it. So if you're naturally a third shift kind of person, if you're nocturnal, then you miss out. You don't get you have to structure it. If you want like a normal office job, you're gonna have to wake up and early as fuck in the morning, like the rest of us. I don't want to do that shit either. So, you know, but the difficulty is you got to. Things have to happen. You have to participate in society. Otherwise, you know, you become a bum. Literally, you go, Joe, you know, Do refrigerators still come in boxes? Yeah, but the rent's outrageous, right? That's the conversations you're gonna have. It's not gonna be good. So you got to get your shit together. That's the plan. Like when you're in those extremes, you need to learn to, and this is what I'm working on actively right now, is trying to figure out how to balance the things that I hate so that they're not overwhelming. And I don't have to constantly deal with the anxiety of thinking about them from either them not being done or, needing to be done at some ambiguous point in the future, right? Because right now I have no schedule for mowing my grass. I cut it when I feel like it. So what that means is I never cut it. So when I do, it's horrible. And all the time that I know it's long and I'm still not cutting it because I don't feel like it, I feel anxious about it because I'm aware that I'm failing I'm failing to fulfill my duties, as a neighbor, as a yard owner. You got to take care of shit. And I realize I'm not. And so it makes me feel anxious. So I'm trying to figure out how to do that. And, that is, it's natural, I guess. I feel like I've hit one of those points in my life where the level of responsibility I've gained is sufficient to the point that I have to start restructuring things again. And, that happens to everyone, clearly. But when it happens, it sucks. I tell you what.
Man loves to create and to build roads. That is beyond question. But why then does he passionately love destruction and chaos? Tell me that. But this is something I want to say 2 words about separately myself. Can it be that he is so dedicated to destruction and chaos, and it's unquestionable that he is at times extremely dedicated to it, and that's a fact, because he is himself instinctively afraid of achieving his goal and completing the edifice that he is constructing? How do you know perhaps he loves the edifice only from afar and not at all at close range? Perhaps he only loves to build and not to live in it, leaving it afterwards. Aux animal, all animal domestiques.
That's some Latin or some shit for you. I don't know what it means or how to pronounce it.
Such as ants, sheeps, and so on and so forth.
It's kind of nothing scarier than getting what you want, right? You get what you want, it's never what you wanted. That's the problem, where there's always something else. So sometimes you don't proceed because you don't want to give up what you have. Sometimes you have to trade wanting something for getting something, right? It's the whole you can't eat your cake and have it too thing. There's something pleasurable about wanting. And something longer term about wanting. You can want something forever, but as soon as you get it, you're back to baseline in 72 hours in the best case. So maybe sometimes we self-sabotage, or I self-sabotage. Because what's worse than getting what you want? Then you have to figure out what to do again, too, because you need a new thing to want, because you can't just be idle. What are you going to do? You got to build something. That's his point.
But man is a flighty, deplorable creature, and like a chess player, he may be fond only of the process of achieving the goal rather than of the goal itself. And who knows? No one can vouch for that. Perhaps the only goal toward which mankind is striving on earth consists of nothing but the continuity of the process of achieving. In other words, of life itself, and not the goal proper, which naturally must be nothing but 2 times 2 is 4. In other words, a formula, and 2 times 2, gentlemen, is no longer a life, but the beginning of death.
Maybe there's no point. But the journey. That's interesting, isn't it? We're building the long road to nowhere. It's all about presence then, yeah. Maybe that is the case. And ultimately, I suppose, maybe this is the cynic in me coming out. That is the case, no matter what, right? Because we all die in the end. It's why it's so easy to be nihilistic. Like, what the fuck does it matter what I do with my whole life? You know, I could fuck off and do nothing and, you know, enjoy myself or not, and, you know, achieve something or not. And at the end, it doesn't really matter because I'm just going to croak, and then I won't be experiencing it or the memory of it anymore. And let's be honest, the option to opt out is not far away at any moment. It's not that hard to die. So there's nihilism for you. So I feel like you have to feel like there's a purpose. Otherwise, why do anything? But what is that purpose? Right? And that's the hard part. That's the hardest part. In my experience. That's the hardest part when you lose religion, right? That's the hardest part since God died. What's the point of all of it? What does it matter, one way or the other, if it all just disappears in the heat death of the universe? For the record, briefly, I believe that the path is important, and that's why, because those nihilistic thoughts I was just describing, those were mine, you know? But I had a realization that the reason it matters is because we care, right? To try to sort of say that in the grand scheme of things it doesn't matter leaves out the fact that every aspect of the grand scheme of things makes up the grand scheme of things, and we are a part of that process. You know, just like I was saying earlier about giving yourself as much respect as you're giving someone else in any given scenario. We experience love, we experience loss, we experience hope and despair, and that's enough reason to care. Maybe 1,000 years from now, we'll all be dead from nuclear war. Maybe we'll live maybe we'll live a long time and spread out through the galaxy. Maybe human beings will see the end of the universe. Maybe not. But I saw today. You saw today. Odds are we'll both see tomorrow. And it would be better if tomorrow was better. I like this.
He is fond of striving toward achievement, but not so very fond of the achievement itself. And this is very naturally terribly funny. In short, man is constructed comically, as there is evidently some joke in all of this.
God has a sense of humor.
After all, man may be fond not only of well-being, perhaps he is just as fond of suffering.
That's another issue I have. I feel like I like suffering. I feel like sometimes I'm suffering and I just lean into it, you know, knowing full well I could alleviate it. I just lean into it. It's like masochism, you know? But it's good. I think suffering is good. And like, you know, Jocko's always like, you know, your leg hurts from doing squats. Good. Do more squats. I feel like, first of all, I feel like I need to do squats. Second of all, I feel like I understand the gist of that, which is suffering makes you strong. And if you learn that, you know, there's this quote I love from Machiavelli in The Prince that I'd butcher. And it's something along the lines of, you get stronger as you overcome difficulties. So a wise prince cunningly seeks out difficulties in order to overcome them so that he can gain strength from doing so. So for that reason, suffering can be fun. Even when it's awful. It's a good thing to think about.
Suffering is the sole root of consciousness.
That's what he says. That's probably true. That is probably, I would bet money that's scientifically accurate. That throughout our evolutionary history, consciousness was developed so that lessons could be learned to avoid suffering. Once the environment got too complex for instant triggers, right? Like Venus flytrap, fly hits hair, trap closes. Once you become, you enter a mammalian society, for instance, even like mice who live complex lives where they must search out and find food and care for young and all of that. Some level of consciousness, some level of being able to observe, interpret, and then react. Something beyond just an instantaneous trigger becomes necessary. And that's also why suffering becomes necessary, is so you know what not to do. Isn't that bizarre? Consciousness is a dirty trick, isn't it? Anyway, that's part 1. I've been sitting here for a while, so I'm going to go. I want to split this up, and I'm going to do part 2 later. And I suspected, because part 2 was, sort of the narrative side, the more story of it. Like I said, it's divided in 2, and the first half is that rant we just kind of ran through a bit. I suspected I'd have less underlined in the last half, but it looks like I've got a decent amount. So, and I need to eat something, so I'm gonna call it. I appreciate you sticking through this with me if you have, and if you haven't, I could really use this opportunity to talk shit about you, and you never hear it, so keep that in mind.